Well, good evening, everyone. It's a great pity that I can't see any of you, but first of all, my congratulations to all of you on becoming teachers. I have to explain that was my ambition when I was young, to become a school history teacher. Unfortunately, I failed to achieve that ambition. I was denied entry to teacher training colleges, several teacher training colleges. And so as a backup career, I had to become a professor of history. So I'm, anyway, greatly in awe of those of you who've managed to become school teachers. I've been asked to say something about the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain, which is a very long history. The book that you can see in front of you is also rather long, so it's a bit difficult to summarize in a short period of time. So what I'm going to do is just show a few of the images from the book. The book contains, I think, over 50 images. I can't show all, but I'm going to show some and then just say a few words about some of them, in the hope that that will introduce some aspects of this very lengthy history. But of course, it can't really do, or I can't really do justice to it in such a short time. So if you have any queries or questions, then feel free to write them in the chat or the Q&A, and I can deal with them a little bit later. Okay, well, I'm going to start off with perhaps a well-known image, although this gentleman didn't come from Africa or the Caribbean, at least not directly from Africa, but this is the famous Cheddar Man, or reconstruction of Cheddar Man, who lived in Britain, the British Isles, about 10,000 years ago. And he's a kind of useful starting point for I would say, for any history of migration. Britain is essentially a country of migrants of one sort or another. And Cheddar Man was one of the first of those migrants. And I suppose the important thing about him or his remains are that when they were first discovered, they were presented, visualized in a very different way, of a man with blonde hair and pale skin and so on and so forth. And it's only recent developments in science which have enabled us to see him in this particular light. And as the Daily Telegraph and many other newspapers informed us, the first Britons were black. It could also have said the first Britons were migrants, I suppose. But anyway, this is one of those first Britons. And the other interesting thing about him is that he resembles all the others who lived in Britain 10,000 years ago, and indeed what people in Europe would have looked like at that time. So it's always important in history to, I think, to recognize change. I often think that history is the study of change, and everything has undergone change, including the population of this country. And it continues to undergo change, and that's quite natural. Change is natural, just as migration into the country is natural, and migration out of the country is natural, whatever the Prime Minister or others may wish to tell us. So that's why it starts, and that's where the book starts. But 10,000 years is rather a long time ago. So we're going to move forward about 8,000 years or so to another set of migrants, and these are, or were, Roman migrants. Now, Africans were almost certainly here or visited these islands before the Romans, but we have very limited information about those migrations. But certainly during Roman times, we have better information. Of course, we have all sorts of information about the African emperor, so-called Septimius Severus. We know there were African governors of Britain, but we all also know something about the the Roman population, as it were, of Britain during that period. And this is one of the most famous discoveries of that population from the city of York. A young woman who has become known as Ivory Bangle Lady because of the jewelry with which she was buried, but she's interesting in the sense that she was clearly of African heritage, as were many others of that period, and one can find their remains in London and in other cities. And in fact, it's unfortunate that not more investigation is done on the skeletal remains that exist, because it's quite likely the case that more of those remains would be the remains of people of African heritage. But Ivory Bangle Lady is the most significant, I think, hitherto. And she's important because there's a tendency of some people to imagine that if Africans appear in this country in ancient times, then they must have been of servile status or even of enslaved status. She was a woman of some wealth and status. And that is also important for our understanding of that population, that there were African men, there were African women, there were African children who were here nearly 2,000 years ago in Roman times. So it's a very ancient history, and it's important to establish that history. It's not a history that began in 1948, as some people still like to tell us and even to celebrate. That's very much a myth, part of the myth of Britain's history. Okay, now if we look at the next 1,000 years or so, we've got very little pictorial information. In fact, my next image takes us to the early Tudor period, the early 16th century. But it's a fact that if we look in nearly every century after the Roman period, we find some evidence of an African presence in the country. I think it was only a few months ago that a young child, about 8 years of age, or the skeleton of a young child, was discovered in Kent, not very far away from where I live, who again was analyzed from her DNA of being of African origin. I believe the scientists even narrowed down her particular DNA to what is today Nigeria, and even to the Yoruba nation. So what somebody from what is today Nigeria, West Africa, was doing in East Kent in the 8th century, we don't yet know. And yet the child of such a person, the child or possibly the grandchild of such a person who migrated from West Africa, was found, as I say, not very far from here. And similar discoveries are being found throughout the centuries in the early medieval period, the medieval period. So the entire period before 1500, there is evidence, and I'm convinced that in years to come, there will be even more evidence of this presence. So that brings us to the 16th century. And again, we know from the latest scholarship that there were hundreds of Africans in Britain, both England and Scotland in particular, during that period. John Blank, who you see pictured here, is perhaps the most famous of those because we have a representation of him. But there were many others. As I say, hundreds of different statuses, occupations, origins, some in the royal court, some musicians, some a whole variety of occupations, some as servants, some as skilled craftspeople, some as divers, some as the whole range of occupations that you can imagine. Again, very important to establish this presence, not that it's necessarily a big deal, but it's just the way that it was at that time. These people, some of them came directly from Africa, because this is the beginnings of the modern connection between England in particular and Africa during that period, but some also came from Europe, from Spain, from Portugal, and probably from other parts of Europe. We know at the moment not very much about their origins. The origins of some, yes, but in general, perhaps not as much as we would like to know. But that presence definitely existed, and I'm sure with more research in the years to come, we'll find out more about this very interesting population. Of course, it's normally or often associated with the alleged proclamations of Elizabeth Tudor. The latest scholarship seems to suggest that Elizabeth Tudor didn't really make any proclamations about the African presence, although some were drafted. But what those drafts indicate, above all else, is not that there was a hostile environment, but that there were certain people who recognized that presence. And for us as historians looking back on it, it gives us even more evidence of the significance of that presence in the 16th century in Britain. Of course, much more could be said, but I'm conscious of time already, so I'm going to move on. And this is an image from probably the late 17th, early 18th century. It's kind of typical of the period, and it shows a feature of English life, or English and Scottish life, in this period, early 18th, late 17th century. And that was a new relationship which existed with Africa that some of you are teaching and studying. This is a representation of the second Duke of Perth, who's not very important, other than the fact that he was a Scottish aristocrat. But what is important about this picture is that it represents a fashion at the time, both for portraits of this kind and for pets of this kind. And this young African boy is essentially a pet in the household of the second Duke of Perth, and many of the rich and important, rich and powerful of that time would have had such pets. As you can see, like cats and dogs, this young boy is wearing a collar, and these young children were generally given pet names as well, and they were kept to show the wealth and the fashion of their owners. It was, as I say, very common, just as other consequences of the human trafficking of Africans during this period became very obvious during that period. Here is a representation of a man called William Answer. William Answer helps us to explain that new relationship, because he was also a temporary migrant to this country, originally from West Africa, what is today Ghana, where he was the son of a human trafficker of that region, who, as was the custom of that time, sent him to England to be educated. Fortunately or unfortunately, he was kidnapped along the way and sold into slavery in Barbados, which rather alarmed his father, although the father was quite willing to sell the sons of other people and traffic the sons and daughters of others. He didn't think that should be something which happened to his own offspring. So William's father made a protest to his business partners in Britain, who were known as the Royal Africa Company. He said, unless my son is brought back, there will be no more human trafficking from this part of West Africa. The Royal Africa Company sent their envoys to Barbados. They found William. They brought him back to London, bought him a nice suit of clothes, accommodated him in the house of the government minister responsible for human trafficking, who was known as the president of the Board of Trade. He stayed in England for some considerable time, went to the theatre, the opera, had his portrait painted, etc., etc. And then when he was eventually returned to his father, the father said, great, that's wonderful. Now human trafficking can recommence. So this was the nature of this trade, as some people refer to it. One of the great crimes against humanity of that period. And you'll notice that the company involved in that great crime was a royal company, and it's one of the features of the monarchy in Britain that they were one of the leading forces in the human trafficking of Africans. In fact, every monarch from Elizabeth Tudor to William Hanover, or whatever his name was, all of them were engaged in human trafficking, which is partly explains where their great wealth comes from. Okay, well, I'm not entirely opposed to the monarchy. This picture comes from the collection of Charles Windsor. It's another aspect of the 18th century. 18th century was not just a period when Africans were enslaved, and of course those who were enslaved were also enslaved in Britain and bought and sold in Britain, but Africans also occupied many other occupations, and one of those was in the military, both in the army and navy. And in fact, throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the Royal Navy, the merchant fleet, and the army all had African recruits. Africans were particularly used as bandsmen, as trumpeters and drummers and so on, but also in many other aspects of or ranks of the military, and many of the leading regiments. This is actually a picture of somebody in one of the monarch's household regiments, which is rather unusual today, but not uncommon in the 18th century. Then, of course, there were others who had a rather different background. This is a woman who's now become famous since the film was made about Elizabeth Dido Lindsay. I won't say much about her other than that she was the nephew of the Lord Chief Justice of England, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. So this is just to give you an idea of the variety of statuses and occupations that existed in that period. The most famous of those 18th century Africans was another migrant, the Lado Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, as he was known, best known for his autobiography, which can be easily found, which was a bestseller, and a book which was written as part of the abolitionist struggle in the latter part of the 18th century in this country. And Equiano toured the country, lectured, spoke about his book, promoted the book, and the aim of it, some of you will be familiar with it, was to attack and undermine human trafficking and to defend the humanity of Africans. So he's a very important figure about whom more could be said, but time doesn't permit us to do that. But one of the things about him was that he was not only an activist as an individual, he was a member of an organization called the Sons of Africa. It was also very important. And another called the London Corresponding Society, which was so important that it was banned by the government of the day. And this is a letter from the secretary of the London Corresponding Society, Thomas Hardy, to a correspondent who, we don't need to worry about who that was, but this person was recommended to him by Lado Equiano or Gustavus Vassa. And you can see from this the politics of Equiano, as well as many others in the London Corresponding Society at that time, and read it for yourself. They adhered very much to the principle of defending the rights of all, a very important political principle, which some people even today haven't fully grasped, but is extremely important in all the struggles for rights and for advancement which face people today as they face people in the 18th century. Okay, let's move on because of time. I'm going to go into the 19th century, and following that same trajectory of the defense of the rights of all, This is, I suppose, one of the key political figures of the 19th century, William Cuffy, one of the leaders of the London Chartists, born in Chatham in Kent, a tailor by profession, and perhaps at a time when workers are again being forced to take all kinds of action to defend their interests. William Cuffy was one of those who led the emergence of the Chartists, which was the first national workers' organization in this country. So it's important, and this was at a time, of course, when working people didn't have the right to vote and had very few rights indeed. And so William Cuffy and others played an important role in those struggles. I won't say more about him now, other than that he was transported for his political activities to Tasmania, where he spent the rest of his life. Well, in the 19th century, we don't have very many images of women. And so this is quite an important one. This woman's name was Fanny Eaton. She came to Britain from Jamaica. She was extremely poor, a mother. I think she gave birth to 10 children. She was a laundress, a charwoman, a needlewoman, somebody who would not normally be remembered or presented to us. But she also posed as an artist model for the Pre-Raphaelite school of painters. And so we have several images of her, sketches as well as paintings which include her. So she's very unusual, but I include her not just for her own worth, as it were, but as a representative of those many women who were here in the 19th century from Africa and the Caribbean that we did not have pictorial representations of. Okay, let's move on. Well, other migrants from that period, this is Jill Celestine Edwards, a lay preacher, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, temperance advocate who toured the country speaking to great crowds. Much more could be said about him. He's a good-looking young man. I actually used him for the cover image of another book, which includes sources, includes extracts from African and Caribbean people and African Americans who wrote about their experiences in Britain in the 18th century and 19th century in the main. Another significant figure, well, here we have Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the famous classical composer, born in Croydon in the 1870s, and who died at a very early age, best known for his choral work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, and the son of a student from West Africa. I mean, he's become a very well-known figure, or a more well-known figure than perhaps he once was. Again, he just shows us the range of occupations, contributions, which existed at that time. He's significant not only as a composer and musician, he also attended the first Pan-African conference held in London in 1900. And it's important to remember that Britain became a center of African and Caribbean and African American Pan-African political activity even before 1900, but particularly from 1900 and throughout the 20th century. That's also an important kind of historical theme and something which I've written about on several occasions. We're moving into the 20th century, and this is Walter Daniel Toll, and I always like to present a Tottenham goal scorer. He's famous both as a footballer and one of the first, not the first, but one of the first black footballers, another Kentish man born in Folkestone. But he's also well known because of his exploits during the First World War. And in recent years, some people have made a big deal of the fact that those from Africa, the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere also participated and contributed to the First World War. And that's certainly very true. Toll was significant because he became an officer. And at that time, there was a color bar in the armed services. And it was extremely unusual for a person of color to become an officer. In fact, several people did become officers. But Walter Daniel Toll was the first British-born person of color to become an officer in the British Army. He was killed in action at the Second Battle of the Somme in 1917. So he's one of those who gave his life in that war. Of course, the nature of that war is another question, and that's something that perhaps there's not enough emphasis on. This is a quote attributed to a man called Isaac Hall, who was a Jamaican and conscientious objector during the First World War. He was imprisoned and tortured in London for his beliefs. But you can see that he has a very clear idea of what that conflict was about, a rather different view to that expressed by Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and others. But I would suggest a more accurate view of what that was all about. So let's move on. We'll leave these guys out just because of time, I think. But one of the features of the 20th century is that we find people of African and Caribbean heritage organizing themselves collectively in various ways. And this is one of those early organizations from the 1920s, the Nigerian Progress Union, formed in London in 1924. But interestingly, it was formed not just by Nigerians, but by a Jamaican migrant, I guess we can call her, Amy Ashwood Garvey, the woman seated in the middle, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, the famous Jamaican Pan-Africanist that some of you might have heard of. And here is the same Amy Ashwood Garvey, where are we, 13 years later, addressing a demonstration in Trafalgar Square, a demonstration against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. Here's yet another demonstration on that theme, this one from Cardiff in Wales. And again, I'm trying to scan a very large period of history, very long period of history. This demonstration, we can say, is a demonstration against war as well as against fascism of that period. And many of those in this particular picture would undoubtedly have been seafarers of one origin or another at a time when there were all kinds of discriminatory laws and practices against seafarers, particularly those from Africa, the Caribbean, as well as from other parts of the world. Again, I can't really go into that in more detail now, but it's this whole question of racism in Britain, particularly in the 20th century, is a very significant part of Britain's history, just as much as colonialism, human trafficking, and so on. And it's very important to understand what was going on at that time, because openly racist legislation was enacted in as early as the 1920s in this country. And here's an example of the effects of that racism, this during the Second World War. This is a woman called Amelia King, who was banned from enlisting in the Land Army. And you can see this is a leaflet in protest. There was, in fact, a whole campaign against racism during the Second World War, where again, it was very much in existence. And this leaflet also talks about the discrimination faced by Leary Constantine, the famous cricketer, and later Lord Constantine during that period. And again, in the armed services, the auxiliary forces, there was a colour bar, as well as in other parts of the country, which is very important to explain and for young people to understand that a war ostensibly fought against fascism. There were still struggles to be fought in this country against racism. Those who served in the war, of course, were not only male and not only in the forces, but also in NHS, or actually this was before the NHS, in the health service of that period. And this is one of those migrants from Nigeria, a woman called Ademola, who was from Nigeria and trained in London. She became well known during the Second World War because a film was made about her called Nurse Ademola, which unfortunately has been lost. And so we only have stills from that film. And of course, she was one of many nurses and doctors that came from Africa during that period and long before that period. So this use, if we can use that word, of African, of Caribbean, of other nurses in the health service in this country has a very lengthy history. And that recruitment goes on to this day. People are still recruited from Africa to serve in the NHS. Well, Nurse Ademola was a member of this organization. This is the West African Students' Union that was formed in 1925 in London. This is pictures from the 1940s. It was an organization of, as its name suggests, the West African students, but it was a political organization, an organization that campaigned against colonial rule, campaigned against racism, that established its own hostels with its own restaurants and lobbied the government on a whole range of issues. And it's important to recognize again that these organizations existed before the late 1940s, where some people think all these things began. At the end of the war, a very important congress was held in Manchester, known as the Fifth Pan-African Congress. It's probably more famous in Africa than it is in Britain, but it was a very important congress. On the platform, again, you can see Amy Ashwood Garvey there. I don't have time to go into it now, but it was a congress which looked forward to the end of colonial rule in Africa, the Caribbean, and so on, and in which key personalities took part, such as Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and others, which I've written about some length. You can probably just see some of the slogans of the Pan-Africanists of that time: down with anti-Semitism, labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself while labor in the black skin is enslaved. These very important considerations. Okay. Well, moving to 1948, and 1948 is an important year because it was a year when the color bar in boxing was broken. Now, as I mentioned before, there was a color bar in many aspects of life in Britain, and one of those areas was boxing. You could not fight for a British title unless you were a person of pure European ancestry. These three gentlemen are the Turpin brothers. They were all boxers, and I get them a little bit mixed up. The most famous of them, I suppose, is Randolph Turpin. Some of you may have heard of. If you haven't heard of Randolph Turpin, you've heard of Sugar Ray Robinson. Well, Randolph Turpin beat Sugar Ray Robinson to become world middleweight champion. But for our purposes, his brother, who went by the nickname of Dick, his name was Lionel, but he was known as Dick Turpin. He was the first boxer of color in the 20th century to fight and win a British title. So, as I mentioned before, this question of the color bar is a very important part of Britain's history. Okay, we can leave that one. Well, this brings us to, I'm again jumping This is an image from 1961, 1962, probably 1961. It's a demonstration against the 1962 Immigration Act, which, as you're probably aware, was an openly racist immigration act, as most of immigration nationality acts are. This one was led by the famous communist Claudia Jones, who you can see in the middle with her handbag there. This Immigration Act had a big impact, not just on migrants, but those who were already settled in the country. And it increased, I suppose, the pressure on migrants. It gave racism further official sanction, in the sense of the idea that immigration was bad, immigrants were bad, and so on. Again, one could go into that in much more detail, but that is also part of this history, and it's always very topical because immigration is always in the news for one reason or another. Well, we go on to the 1970s, and this is one of the community newspapers of that time, Grassroots, published by the Black Liberation Front, and you'll see the headline, which I'm sure will be of interest to you, and has now become, again, a little bit more well-known, the whole issue of children being labeled as educationally subnormal. There were big struggles in the schools of that period to overcome this form of stereotyping, discrimination, which existed. So it was a particular struggle of the 1970s, I would say, just as other similar struggles, which I'll go on to mention, that were faced immigrants, or more particularly faced the children very often, or sometimes the grandchildren of migrants, of course, as well as those who were born in this country. So the problems in education was one particular area of struggle in the 1970s. Another was the actions of the police. It's now become fashionable, of course, to criticize the police, but in the 1970s it wasn't fashionable. Or it certainly wasn't accepted that the police were racist, that the police were misogynistic, that the police were homophobic, and so on. These things were only very gradually established. And this is a famous case of 4 young men who were attacked and beaten up by the police. Police were in plain clothes and attacked them as they came out of Oval Station in 1972. And then charged them with all kinds of bogus offences. And they have, or Winston True, who was one of the young men who was actually imprisoned on these bogus charges, campaigned for 50 years to clear his name, and finally, 2 years ago, I think, finally cleared his name. And it was, what came out was that the police involved were corrupt and so on. But the point about this case is it's just an example of, there were many cases of this kind, and this is perhaps the most well known of that period. Let's leave that one. Well, this is a picture of 1981, Black People's Day of Action, which was held after the New Cross fire, or New Cross massacre as it was known. I guess the most important thing about that, it was a historic demonstration. The most significant thing about all of that was that 13 young people died in a fire in suspicious circumstances, and there was no official condolence from anybody, not from the monarch, not from the government. And a few weeks after that, there was a disaster in Ireland, and the monarch immediately sent a note of condolence. And people of my age, I was actually on that demonstration. I don't think we'll ever forget that. And it's also part of this rich history. Okay, well, I kind of come to a conclusion now. This is my friend Agi Lewis, I went to university with, pictured with her son, Shenny. And Shenny was admitted to hospital in South London 12, maybe 13 years ago. And when he tried to leave, he was restrained, I think the word is, by 11 police officers and killed. And I include his image again as not only because of the tragedy of Shenny and the Lewis family, but because this is again one of many cases in recent years. Again, it's also part of this history of what it means to be a person of African and Caribbean heritage. It doesn't only affect people of African and Caribbean heritage, but particularly affects people from that background. And it's important in history, not to lose sight of these terrible crimes that are committed. Of course, nobody has been brought to book or held to account for Shenny's death. And then lastly, we come to 2020, where we had an unprecedented and historic occasion throughout the country, from Land's End to John O'Groats, of people expressing, perhaps for the first time in this way, and reflecting on some of the issues which I've mentioned, which were particularly prevalent in the 20th and 21st century, of course, prompted by the terrible events in the US. But as many people explained, Britain wasn't innocent. And one of the things which came out of the 2020 demonstrations was a greater concern with history and how history is presented and represented. And so that's a good place, I think, to bring my rather hurried presentation to a conclusion.
Thank you. That was excellent. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I think I agree as well. It's an incredibly personal place to end. I know I speak for a lot of history teachers. You know, steal from Dan Lyndon Cohen, and as a history teacher, I very much stand on the shoulder of giants, Dan Lyndon Cohen being one of them, and obviously people like Martin Spafford. But a lot of us have been kind of banging the drum for migrant history, for Black history, for brown history, etc., for a long time without people taking notice. And suddenly things seem to start to change after Black Lives Matter. So it's a horrendous circumstance that I had to take something like that for it to happen. But in a way, there has been good that's come out of it. But so, yeah, a very personal place to end, and very much resonated with me. There have been some questions coming in on the Q&A already, so please keep coming those in. We'll go to those in a minute, but I have a question myself, first of all, and I think it should be quite obvious already, but as somebody who's obviously so steeped in the world of migrant history, why do you think it is so important for schools to teach it?
Well, I would put it this way. I think it's important for young people, I mean, for all people, but we're particularly concerned with young people, to understand the world in which they live. And so that means that they have to have an understanding of Britain's past in its entirety. You can't understand the world in which you live by being presented with a distorted picture of that world. If you studied history but you didn't study women, or didn't study working people, the majority, I know that's Michael Gove's view of history, but that kind of suggests that Michael Gove doesn't want young people to understand the world in which they live. Those of us who do want them to understand, then that history has to be presented as it is, or as it was. And Britain's history is a history of migrants, of migration from the earliest times. There's nothing kind of subversive about it. That's just the fact. So let's provide young people with the facts, with understanding that this is the history of the country, that it's undergone change, that it has connections with other parts of the world, that these are the consequences of those connections, that these are the contributions that people have made. You know, it's just presenting the world as it is. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've obviously touched on this, and Martin Spafford talks about this as well, but it's real people's stories. I think it's also the only GCSE that actually enables you, or maybe the only topic which actually enables you to do real history from the bottom down, it almost feels like. And actually, I think that's really powerful for a lot of young people. So if you don't teach migrants to Britain, please switch. It's great. And if you want any help with resources, I'm sure obviously there's Hakim Adi's books, but I'm also very welcome. I'm happy to say here, I'm welcome to share my resources for migration widely if people are looking to switch. So in addition, if you'll indulge me, one last question, and then we will go to the Q&A, I promise everybody. You said right at the top that, I know you've touched on it again then actually, that history is a subject that really is about change. And I absolutely agree with you. However, often my students in teaching the Migrants to Britain course are quite adept actually at picking out continuities, especially in the kind of experience of and treatment of migrants who are arriving in Britain. So I guess what continuities have you kind of picked out through your studies of migrants, and which would you argue are perhaps the most significant? And I will take those to my year 10s tomorrow.
Well, obviously there are continuities in the sense that we live in a certain type of world, which we can say is a world, if we just take the modern world as the last 500 years or so, you know, that world is you can say the capital-centered world, which is based on, amongst other things, the exploitation of other countries by the rich and powerful in this country and a few other countries, you know. And so you have an inequality which exists in the world. Let's put it in that way. So that is a continuity, if you like, that we still live in that world, and what happened 500 years ago still resonates with us today. So, you know, it's not just that human trafficking continues today, it's that the human trafficking which took place across the Atlantic and elsewhere in that period, in the period from the 15th century to the 19th century, that has massive consequences for the kind of world in which we live, whether it's in football, or it's the monarchy, or it's the major institutions of this country, the stately homes, the Bank of England, the national debt, the stock exchange, everything comes out of that world. So if you want to, again, if you want to understand that world, then you are looking both at, first of all, at the continuity, the nature of that world. But the other thing, and of course it produces and has given rise to things like racism and so on. But then the other continuity, which is important from that, is the attempts of people to resist the imposition of that world or the consequences of that world. So, for example, one of the things I start to do, I don't do it throughout the whole book in a concentrated way, but one of the elements which is very important to highlight in the book is the theme of anti-racism, which is also a continuity. And in the past, people have perhaps made a big deal about, you know, racism has been in Britain a long time and so on, but what that means is that anti-racism has been in Britain for a long time, and that, as I mentioned, the struggle of people like Equiano and Thomas Hardy, and even those before them, protesting against human trafficking, protesting against the characterization of Africans as not human beings and so on. That has a very, very long history in this country, a history which continues to this day. So that is also a theme of continuity, which needs to be brought out. And there are many others as well, but then just to give a quick example.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and actually not something that my ear turns have picked out yet. So I'll bring that to them tomorrow. That's really interesting. There have been lots of questions and things coming in. So a couple of quick ones. Jay Halliday, sorry, I'm not sure your first name, asks, and I don't know if we have any estimates about this, but if we know how many people roughly in the 1970s were imprisoned due to racism. I guess that might be quite hard to define, say.
There probably are statistics. I don't know what they are offhand. There almost certainly are statistics. But certainly in terms of arrests, it was very common for people to be, I mean, the figures for kind of stop and search, SAS as it was called at that time, which meant being, you could be stopped and arrested under suspicion that you were about to commit something. You hadn't done anything, but you were suspected that you might. So SAS, as it was called, led to a lot of arrests and harassment. There will be some figures for that. I don't know what they are offhand. And then there are people, obviously, who were arrested, as I indicated, with the Oval 4 for various bogus charges. I'm sure there are statistics on that. I don't know what they are offhand. Maybe that's a project for some school or some class to look into that. I'm sure those figures can be easily found.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Another quick one that's coming from Derek is about the royal family and how much they got paid for the abolition of slavery, I think, or how much they were paid. I think you should be able to find that, Derek, on the UCL Legacies of Slave Ownership. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that. Yeah,
that's the best place to look. That's the best place to look.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, I don't think the monarchy has yet set up its website on these kinds of things like the Church of England has done. But I'm sure it won't be long. I'm sure their days are not long.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, as it were. So that will probably be something that they'll take up pretty soon and find some way of presenting themselves in the appropriate light. But that was a feature of the monarchy. I mean, that's what they did. That's what the monarchy was about. Some of them even boasted. I mean, Queen Anne, didn't she, boasted about how she'd got the Asiento from Spain. William Hanover stood up in the House of Lords. Abolition? What abolition? We're talking about abolition. Shocking idea, disgraceful. That's the monarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's why these stories are so important for us to teach. Another question that's come in, what do we know about African and Caribbean people in Britain during the medieval period? Is there any current research on this? All I know about is Ormrod's book, but I'm conscious, well, and obviously yours as well, but I'm conscious that you may have a better answer than me.
There's not that much. I've tried to include some things in my book. The information is kind of scattered, that there isn't really that very much, as I'm aware of, very much kind of concentrated research on that period, on the period literally before 1500. So there's scattered information on, you know, there's some research on the Black Death and burials in the Black Death. There's research on individual sightings of people and so on. In fact, I have a student who's just applied to do a PhD with me who wants to look at that whole period. I think part of the problem is that it's very much based on archaeological research, and some of that research, there isn't very much of that research. It can also be quite expensive to do DNA testings on skeletons and so on and so forth. So, as I said in my presentation, almost every century there are examples of Africans being here in this country, but saying more than this individual existed or these individuals existed, there isn't much more than that can be said at the moment. But I'm sure in years to come, when people do the research, more information will emerge.
it's very exciting about your PhD candidate as well. I look forward to hopefully something being published from that. That'll be very useful. And another question that's come in, which I wonder whether this is quite a good one to end on. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic? Sorry, it's just moved in front of me. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about change in this country? As you said, there's lots of continuity. Do you think there will come a time when we look back at widespread racism as a thing of the past?
Yes, I'm very optimistic. I mean, optimism depends on us. So if we're doing things to change things, and as historians, as we're the students of change, we also have to be involved in change. If we are, then we'll be very optimistic. If we're not, then we'll be very pessimistic. So I don't know whether the questioner is an optimist or a pessimist, but I'm an optimist. I think that history is on our side. And certainly if we study history, if we understand history, and if we make history, then yeah, the future will be bright.
And I suppose as well, I feel quite strongly that as history teachers, we're a really important part of that. So if I'm still talking to history teachers who are with us today, who aren't teaching migrants to Britain at GCSE, please do, because it's really actually an incredibly good course and it's incredibly interesting for our students. But I think, as we've outlined this evening, it's really important, incredibly important. So if you want to talk or want some help with resources, let me know, because I'm happy to share if it means people take it up.
Yeah, I think the other thing about history is that I mean, not just in schools, but in the wider society, there is a definite struggle going on over history. And, you know, the powers that be are a little bit concerned, as they always are, but they're perhaps more concerned now about what is being taught, what is being spoken about, what is being presented in the media on all of these issues. And I was having another meeting today about the migrated archives at the National Archives, where the government, the powers that be, hid all these documents about the period of decolonization, so-called. So always there has been this struggle, but I think particularly today it's very acute. If you go onto the Policy Exchange website, which I'm not encouraging people to do, but if they did, and look at what one of the government's chief think tanks, you'll see that it's monitoring everything that goes on in regard to history. Someone's changed the name of a road, or we note that down. So this struggle is becoming very, very sharp, and one of the features of it is disinformation about all sorts of things. And so teachers of history have a very important role to play in combating disinformation, not in what we say, but in the way that we encourage students to investigate things for themselves, to look at evidence, to not be swayed by what they read in the Daily Mirror or Daily Mail or whatever, but yeah, to think for themselves. So I think that's very important in the current climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm reminded of something that a history teacher, pedagogy expert, which I'm sure lots of people on here who will know, Arthur Chapman, who says we teach students to read books, to joust with books, rather to read or any kind of form of media, but we teach them to read and joust with it rather than to treat it as a gospel. And I think that's really important and pertinent, isn't it? Especially with this. I think a great place to end. Thank you so much for this evening.
You're welcome.
I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure everyone else on here has as well. So there's all that's left really for me to say is thank you again, and thank you everybody for being here with us.
You're welcome. Anytime. Take it easy.